The rancher believed he knew the price of everything in this world. He lived in silence and solitude until he saw her in the square, being sold like an object. For $1, he thought he was buying a woman to save, but in her eyes, there was not gratitude, but a thirst for revenge. And he found himself in the very center of that war. And before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss this and other Wild West stories. Silas's gray eyebrows furrowed like storm clouds over the steppe. 15 years had passed since he buried his wife, Anya, and since then, his homestead had lived in a hollow silence, broken only by the mournful wail of the wind and the creak of the well crane. Silas had grown used to it. He found peace in monotonous labor, in the smell of freshly cut grass, and in the endless sky as vast as his sorrow. Breakfast at 5 in the morning. Work until sunset. Coffee by the fire until the stars shone so brightly you could count everyone. And not a single word. It was not a life, but a ritual. Sheltered, predictable, and, so he believed, eternal. But everything ended on a Wednesday when he went to town. The town greeted him with dust and shouting. The air was filled with the stench of sweat, cheap whiskey, and horse manure. Silas didn't like this place, but he couldn't survive without supplies. He moved quickly, trying to get what he needed as soon as possible. But in the main square, his gaze was caught by a crowd. It was angry, loud, and greedy. In the center, a bulky man with greasy whiskers waved a whip. Beside him, on a folding chair, sat a woman. Her hands were tied. Her clothes were dirty fringe and worn leather. And on her face was a glacial calm that seemed capable of freezing the entire stuffy town. She was Apache, and she was being sold. Who'll give more? The whiskered man yelled. Strong, tough, resilient. All for just $10. The crowd snickered, making crude jokes. No one wanted to pay. She was dangerous, wild, a threat. But her gaze, her eyes were black as the night in his canyon, and filled with the same silence he so cherished. There was no fear in them, only a bottomless, cold determination. Silas suddenly felt his tranquility crack. He didn't know why. He didn't want her. But the thought of that silence being broken by someone else's cruelty was unbearable. $1, he said loudly. Everyone turned. Laughter broke out. The whiskered man smirked, as if Silas had done him a favor. $1. You want her. She's dangerous. $1, Silas repeated, tossing the coin onto the ground. It fell into the dust with a clang. 5 minutes later, he was riding out of town, leading the tied woman behind him. She walked without stumbling, her back straight as an arrow, her gaze burning into the back of his head. He felt her hatred, not for him, but for this world that sold people for $1. He had bought her, but she was not his property. She was a predator in a trap, and it was only a matter of time before she tore that trap to shreds. The journey to the canyon was long. The woman did not utter a word. When they arrived at the cabin, he untied her hands and gestured toward the door. Go inside, he said simply. She didn't move. Her black eyes studied him, searching for lies, weakness, a hidden threat. Silas wearily waved his hand. I don't need a slave. You're free. It's just, you won't survive alone. She scoffed. A cold, soundless laugh. This laugh was even more terrifying than her hatred. But she followed him inside anyway. The cabin was simple and clean. She slowly inspected every corner, every object. Not like a guest, like a predator studying new territory. My name is Silas, he said. Naya, she answered softly. It was her first word. It landed like a blow. The first few days were unbearable. The silence was gone. Now, it was filled with tension. They ate at the same table, but separately. They slept under the same roof, but she always sat cross-legged, her back against the wall, staring into the darkness. She didn't help with the chores. She simply existed. But Silas noticed how she studied him, how she watched when he chopped wood, how she followed his movements when he cleaned his rifle, how she observed him when he walked through the canyon. It wasn't curiosity. It was planning. A plan to escape, or a plan to attack. Naya was not just a woman. She was a warrior. Silas saw this when one day she went out of the cabin and caught a rabbit using only a sharp stone and incredible speed. She knew how to track game, read trails, and move as silently as a shadow. He realized he hadn't bought a bride. He had bought power. Untamed, wild, but incredibly potent. Gradually, the tension began to change. There was no open hostility. There was respect. He saw how she worked, how she carried herself, and he understood that he had bought something more than just a body. He had bought a soul. And he couldn't break it. One day, when he was sitting by the fire, she sat down across from him. For the first time. Why did you buy me? She asked. Silas looked up. Her gaze was still cold, but the hatred was gone. I don't know, he answered honestly. I didn't like that man. She nodded. It wasn't an answer, but it was all she needed to hear. She accepted his response, but the calm was short-lived. One day, as Silas was returning from a hunt, he saw a footprint on the ground. Not his own. Not Naya's. The heavy print of a boot he had seen only once. In town. He stopped. Froze. His quiet life was over. Now it wasn't just disrupted. It was in danger. Silas entered the cabin. Naya was sitting by the fire, mending her clothes. Her hands moved quickly, skillfully. He threw a piece of jerky on the table. She raised her head. We're being followed, he said. They're the men of the man who sold you. Naya froze. Her whole body tensed. He won't let me go, she said softly. I escaped from him. I was his captive. She told him her story. Her tribe had been destroyed. She was taken prisoner, and they wanted to sell her to a brothel. She escaped, killing 2 guards. But they caught her. And now she was being sold, not as a woman, but as a wild beast, to show others what happens to those who dare to resist. He knows I'm dangerous, she said. He won't stop. Silas's eyes narrowed. He was no hero. He was a rancher. But he saw in her eyes the same thing he had seen in town. A threat that was directed not at him, but at the world that had created her. And he could not let that world win. Then we'll fight, he said. He pulled his old Winchester from under the bed and began to clean it. Naya watched him. There was no surprise in her gaze, only understanding. She stood up, went to the wall, and took her knife from a shelf, sharp as a razor. Her weapon, her only salvation. They waited. The canyon, which had once been a quiet sanctuary, now became a trap. Every rustle, every creak of the wind made them jump. They turned the cabin into a fortress. They boarded up the windows, gathered water, and prepared their weapons. Silas, who had known only tranquility, now lived on adrenaline. He saw Naya transform into a warrior. Her eyes gleamed in the darkness, and her movements were swift and precise. The attack came at dawn. They heard the horses from a distance. Silas took a position by the window, and Naya by the door. She was not afraid. She was waiting. We've come for the woman, yelled the very same man. Give her up, and you'll live. Silas didn't answer. A shot rang out instead. It hit one of the bandits squarely in the shoulder. The shootout began immediately. Bullets whistled, shattering the wooden walls. They were 2 of them, and 10 of their enemies. But they were in their canyon. They knew every rock, every tree. Naya was incredible. She moved like a shadow, appearing and disappearing, striking and evading capture. She was not just a warrior. She was a part of this land, this wild nature that bowed to no one. Silas was stunned. He thought he was buying a woman, but he had bought an army. The battle ended. 2 remained. Silas, wounded, but alive. And Naya. She stood over the body of the man who had sold her. His eyes were wide with terror. He couldn't win. She had simply plunged the knife into his heart. The canyon fell into silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was heavy, filled with the smell of blood and gunpowder. Silas sat by the hearth, bandaging the wound on his arm. Naya watched him. Now she sat not opposite him, but beside him. Her shoulder touched his. I thought you would leave, he said. Leave for where? She asked. This world wanted to buy me. I don't want to live in it. She told him that her people had been killed. Her tribe was gone. She had nowhere to go. And she didn't want to go back to a world so cruel. There was no despair in her eyes, only weariness. Then stay, Silas said. Stay here. He didn't know what he was saying. He only knew that his quiet life was over. Now, it would contain not only the crunch of snow, but her silence. Not only the whisper of the wind, but her breath. He had bought her for $1, but he had paid much more for it. He had paid with his former life. She nodded. It wasn't an answer. It was a promise. A promise to stay. A promise to fight together. They sat in silence, but now it was not the silence of solitude. It was the silence of 2 souls who had found each other in the cruelest of worlds. It was the silence of a new beginning. And it was only a matter of time before they would face that world again. They were ready.